Welcome to Let's Read Hoodoo, a Hoodoo book club. This is episode 4. We are continuing with our reading and study of Stories of Rootworkers and Hoodoo in the Mid-South by Toni Cale. If you haven't heard part 1 of this reading, it is in the description box below. Also, take a look at your screen. I know this is audio format, but take a quick look at your screen. Click that eye in the top right corner, and all readings will be linked there. Also, look at your screen. I have ways that you can support me and the Hoodoo Book Club. I'm not sure if you all are aware, but reading text such as these on a platform like YouTube means that every now and then these videos will be demonetized and I won't earn anything. And this is what I do, y'all. So please support me. I've left all the ways that you can support on the screen. And if there are texts that you would like for me to read, please use the email on the screen. I really want to invest in a better microphone for you all, so please support me. Thank you. Now, let's get into our reading of Stories of Rootworkers and Hoodoo in the Mid-South by Toni Cale. We are starting off at page 21. If you don't have the text in front of you, that's okay. I've left links in the description box down below of where you can purchase this text. There are e-versions, hardbook, and paperback, but I am the one supplying the audio version. Now, we're on page 21. We are still in the first chapter, The Secret Institution. We're going to start at healthcare and root work. Root working practices were frequently met with dismissal and in some cases disdain by not only the law, but also those in the medical field. African healing techniques in areas like Louisiana in the 1940s were blamed for the spread of diseases and hindrances to preventative care. Issues like the growth of syphilis in African American communities was blamed on the indifference from the root working community. Spiritual healers were frequently referred to as quacks and witch doctors. Louisiana state officials warned the outside community about African practices. A report from the Works Project Administration, WPA, Venereal Disease Control Project warned, "We know of a number of instances in which Negroes have paid from $1 to $50 to voodoo doctors for charms to ward off evil spirits. In most instances, the charm better known to the victims of the voodoo doctors as the hand usually consists of a bag filled with a concoction of crushed bone, peach seeds, frog stools, and other ingredients. This bag they wear around the neck. Sometimes the treatment of the voodoo doctor is accompanied by chants in unknown tongue and by dances and other primitive maneuvers." Along with ethnocentric descriptions like primitive, health departments began to post signs and posters featuring images of root workers warning the public of their dangerous practices. One particular poster featured a group of African American men sitting around a boiling cauldron while a witch doctor provided over a healing ceremony. The witch doctor in question was actually a local New Orleans healer who had been photographed preparing a mojo hand. The WPA would go on to have several interactions with African and African American spirituality, including the collection of testimonies of former slaves and their role in the spiritual healing and healing cultures, and the production of federally funded version of Shakespeare's Macbeth that became known as Voodoo Macbeth, featuring an all-black cast performing the Bard's classic set in Haiti and directed by none other than Orson Welles. Medical professionals seem to be either fascinated by the holistic methods of root work used to heal both physical and spiritual, or appalled at the use of such works. Some professionals claim to have patients who were undergoing stress that were attributed to conjure. The 1949 death of a 32-year-old African-American female in Montgomery brought attention to cultural stresses and trauma as a possible result of conjure. The woman had discovered a number of strange objects around her home, including various cloths, feathers, and colored vials of powder. She feared that someone had crossed her, and she had begun to panic. Over a period of 5 days, the woman began to grow physically ill. The following evening, she dropped dead. Her death certificate stated that she had died of an acute heart failure. However, the local press stated that the coroners, doctors, and others who signed death certificates are somewhat loath to sign their names to a certificate with the cause of death as voodoo, obeah, wenga, or other names for the black art which has existed in the South since before the war between the states. Alabama state toxicologist Dr. C.J. Riling had testified at a number of trials involving conjure. Riling in his spare time began to collect a number of fetishes, as they were called, including amulets made from animal remains in mojo bags. The toxicologist spoke on the effectiveness of conjure. Voodoo can kill. There are, of course, many complex elements that contribute to such death. The degree of superstition of the victim, cardiac condition, the pitch of fear, imagination, fear of the unknown, some neurosis reflected in the physical condition, education, and hysteria inclination. Physicians in Tennessee and Mississippi were often critical of black spiritual healers in the Mid-South. Memphis-based physicians had been noted as criticizing the growth of spiritual healers on Beale Street and the loss of patients to root workers in the city. The Mississippi State Board of Health became so concerned about the popularity of African American spiritual doctors that they issued a public statement regarding the system of healing. In Mississippi, quacks grade all the way from ignorant, itinerant hoodoo doctors to the urbane variety who draw customers from the very elite of our population, declared Dr. R.N. Whitefield, the Assistant Secretary to the State Board of Health. The board went on to smudge potential benefits of hoodoo. Essential to the success of hoodoo, or the most pretentious quack, is the ability to deceive the public into believing that he possesses a miraculous cure for any complaint. By insisting on this logic, the state of Mississippi appeared to assure its citizens that any form of spiritual healing was dubious at best. The fear of African healing systems would continue to affect national decisions regarding health and disease. In 1958, a number of school children in Atlanta, Georgia became sick with an allergy that was later believed to be traced back to a specific artifact. Voodoo dolls from Haiti were believed to be the culprit, following an importation of small dolls made from cashew nuts and charcuterie beans. Newspapers alleged that a hoodoo was connected with the importation of the dolls. The fear of the dolls spread throughout the United States, with officials in cities such as Canton, Ohio, removing dolls from local shops. Almost 20 years later, the perceived threat of African traditions was feared to be entering the schoolhouses of rural Mississippi in April 1976, as students from Mount Pleasant, Mississippi schools started exhibiting strange behaviors. Officials noted that over 15 students and several teachers had suddenly begun fainting at the Sand Flats High School. Local papers reported teachers and students who have seen the spells said the girls suddenly fall to the ground, kicking and shouting, "Don't let it get me," and "Get it off." The attacks last from few minutes to as long as 15 minutes. Some pupils contend that one girl had been putting voodoo hexes on her classmates as the result of an argument over a boy. The sheriff said that some of the students may have a strong belief in black magic. Marshall County Sheriff Kenneth Smith brought in a state of narcotics agents, a highway patrol investigator, and a number of deputies to investigate the possibility of narcotics as the prime suspect of this odd behavior. authorities found no evidence of drug use or voodoo. The fear of spiritual doctors and conjurers using coercive techniques such as hypnosis and suggestion on clients became a part of the paranoia as well. As far back as 1928, practitioners were accused of using quackery to deceive clients. Dr. J. W. Gillespie, who touted himself as a palmist and hoodoo expert, had been walking the streets of Greenwood, Mississippi, selling various alleged magical objects. The self-proclaimed doctor promised to bring loved ones back together and to even get rid of those who might interfere in your love life. Some items Gillespie was discovered using included rabbit's feet, mercury, and other traditional materials. Gillespie was warned to leave town but returned and was arrested for extorting money by false pretense. In the 1930s, Mississippi spiritual doctor Edgar Simmons was arrested for false pretense after it was discovered he was collecting money for herbal remedies and various spiritual rituals. Officials claim Simmons had allegedly hypnotized several women in the city, which were believed to have led to nervous conditions and insanity. Mid-South spiritual doctors counted on the reliability of traditional remedies that had proven successful and the work of spiritual to bring about good health for clients. Unfortunately, in some cases, this was not enough. In Mississippi, faith healer Lula Lee King cried as she watched the health of her 10-year-old daughter begin to deteriorate. Her little girl began to cough uncontrollably and would eventually become unresponsive. King had prayed for her daughter's healing and even took the child to a local physician. Nothing seemed to help the little girl. The mother began to wonder if the problem was more than a simple illness. The mother believed that the child could have a spiritual problem. Lula decided to take the child to visit a local spiritual healer. The healer, Toby Fulford, prescribed the use of a traditional remedy to combat some of the child's symptoms. Fulford turned to friends, Pastor Alex Ward and spiritual healer J.M. Dixon. Ward and Dixon were well known in the local African American community for providing healing treatments and medical supplies. Reverend Ward sold a line of herbal teas called Grandma's Teas, some topical ointments, and a bottle of mineral water. Dixon was believed to have known of specific rituals and herbs used in healing. Together, the men concocted a treatment involving the use of compound consisting of a cream of tartar, Epsom salts, and sulfur to be placed on the child's skin to fight off skin rashes. Police were called in after the child began to choke on what was described as regurgitated matter in her tiny lungs. The child had been administered a number of potions in order to remove a hex that her mother believed was harming the girl. The child lacked food or running water and was placed in the shack that the local district attorney described as a shanty filled with hexes and voodoo signs. The child's mother, the spiritual healers, and minister were all charged by the police for the child's death. Conjure and the Church. Reverend William W. Cawley was recognized as the only African-American Baptist to have served as an appointed missionary of both a white-administered missionary agency and a black-administered missionary agency. He was appointed to serve as a missionary to Africa by the Southern Baptist Convention in 1875, and later as a missionary with an African American Baptist Association known as the Baptist Foreign Missions Conference. In the fall of 1880, the membership of Beale Street Baptist invited Reverend Cawley to speak to the congregation about work being performed in Africa. That continent held an important place in the hearts and minds of the church members, as the church itself was built by many former slaves. The missionaries spoke of ministry work being done in Africa and the pride that the black community should have for the work and people of Africa. He spoke about the evil of witch doctors and voodoo in Africa as he displayed several artifacts to members of the congregation. Earlier in the year, newspapers have reported that he would be speaking in the Carolinas and would be displaying African curiosities collected while there among, which are specimens of the African gods. In Memphis on Beale Street, the women in the congregation were noted as being particularly interested in what were called voodoo bags on display at the church. One of the reasons this may have resonated with the congregants was that the use of the mojo and nation bags or sacks were popular during this time in Memphis and on Beale. As the missionaries spoke on the threat of voodoo in Africa, he also mentioned the practice of African-derived practices in the South. A reporter noted that Mr. Colley explained that to believe in the conjuring was superstition, and he hoped no one present believed in it. The reporter noticed that several voices were heard saying, "Yes, sir, they do believe in it. They all believe in it." The reporter worked for a Memphis-based newspaper that reported, "This closed the entertainment as our reporter left the building. He heard several colored men say, 'He's one of them conjurers himself,'" referring to the visiting speaker. Many churches in the Mid-South viewed root-working and conjure-related practices as being of the devil. In October 1954, Bethel Baptist Church, an African-American house of worship in Meridian, Mississippi, called local police when it was discovered that two men had placed a mysterious powder throughout the church. Powder had been poured around the pulpit, in the pastor's study, and a number of chairs. The congregation members told the police that they believed the men were attempting to hoodoo the pastor and the church itself. In traditional hoodoo-related practices, powder was frequently used in an attempt to cross an enemy. The belief was if someone came into contact with the powder or stepped over it, they would suffer. Some ministers rallied against these traditional folk practices in sermons and publications. A 1961 tent revival in Jackson, Tennessee, featured Reverend C.R. Graham, who was promoting his sermon series, Root Doctors, Fortune Tellers, Conjure Specialists, Window Smokers, and Hair Hiders, How They Operate. Traditional African practices were viewed by many as the bane of the Black community. Some churches felt that hoodoo-related practices were not only spiritually dangerous, but also posed physical threats to the community. 5 years later, an evangelist traveling through the Mid-South preached against the evils of African practices. The Reverend Henry T. Beyer claimed to have been converted in New Orleans from a background of hoodooism, voodooism, and spiritualism. The Mid-South has also been home to a number of incidents involving African folk practices, such as hoodoo within churches. One of the fascinating phenomena in Mississippi and in Memphis hoodoo history was the crossing of social networks and cultures. Ministers, root workers, and conjurers form relationships in this network and in some cases took the role of all three of these offices. Many academics have noted the alleged African folk practices associated with Memphis-based Church of God in Christ founder C.H. Mason and his use of roots and spiritual practices. Another personality who worked both in the pulpit and with various aspects of the root-working culture was Bishop A.B. McEwen. Bishop McEwen had been ordained as a minister by Bishop Mason and served as a minister in Covington and Murray City, Tennessee. As curio companies like Lucky Heart Cosmetics out of Memphis began offering cosmetics and hoodoo-related curios such as oils, powders, and herbs to primarily African-American customers, they also began expanding into a number of unique markets. Among these markets were churches and religious organizations. Bishop McEwen was instrumental in bringing Lucky Heart Cosmetics into church conventions. This controversial marketing of hoodoo-related products, often deemed witchcraft by some, into church conventions was a bold move by McEwen. Following Bishop McEwen's death in 1969, his role in the hoodoo curio culture remained a secret to many in the church community. Personal interviews with root workers and curio shop owners from this period reveal that many knew of his work as both minister and curio salesman. One shop owner shared what he knew, and he shared that he knew McEwen personally and that McEwen would travel around West Tennessee speaking at churches. His presentation usually included messages about the mission work that was being done in countries like Africa. Following the message, he would take several cosmetic items and place them on a table in front of the sanctuary. He instructed members of the congregation to leave a dime and pick up an item. The last person to leave a dime would win a prize contained in a large box that was on display with the items. The lucky person who won the box soon discovered that the box was actually a sales kit from the Lucky Heart Cosmetics and that they became a salesperson. That was their prize. McEwen was allegedly seen driving around Memphis in a luxury car that was given to him by the owners of Lucky Heart. Bishop McEwen became the face of the church community for Lucky Heart Cosmetics, as his photo was frequently used as an endorsement of cosmetics and curios. He is credited with creating the formula for Lucky Heart Cosmetics' four-way line of products. I spoke with the minister at Humboldt, Tennessee in 2016, who shared a story about how certain spiritual curios are still being used by some ministers in West Tennessee. One particular throat spray was promised to spiritually empower ministers to be able to whoop. Whooping is a gasping sound that marks the intake of air and is interpreted by some as the presence of the Holy Spirit during preaching. The pastor said he used the product a few times, but then became convicted that he was relying on a product and not his deity for guidance during his sermons. The mixture of spiritual workers and traditional churches could be seen in a 1949 court case in Jackson, Tennessee. The case focused on the prosecution of the spiritual leader of a spiritualist temple for allegations of mail fraud, Bishop Willie S. Sheffield, leader of the International United Revelation People's Spiritualist Temple of Applied Christianity in Jackson, was brought up on charges of using the postal system to con believers. Sheffield's witnesses claimed that the spiritual leader could cure sickness. He had performed prayers that could remove pain even over the phone. The leader would practice laying on of hands on his clients to remove their ailments. The judge observed that the healer did not do any harm, and the jury found that he actually gave sound advice to his clients. Bishop Sheffield was released with no charges. The bishop would go on to lead the People's New Way Spiritualist Church on Church Street in Jackson. The town of Alexander City, Alabama, is home to a fascinating murder mystery involving conjure and religions that is so compelling that famed Southern writer Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird, wanted to write a novel based on the story. The tale of Reverend Willie Maxwell begins with the mysterious death of his wife, Mary Edwards Maxwell, who was discovered beaten and strangled in a car in 1916. The minister was indicted for murdering his wife, but before the trial could begin, the principal star witness in the case married Maxwell and then changed her testimony against him. 2 years later, Maxwell's brother was found dead of excessive alcohol consumption on a rural road. An investigator with the local sheriff's department determined that the victim, Columbus Maxwell, may have been forced to drink a fatal amount of alcohol. 2 years later, the minister's second wife was found dead in a car near their home. The cause was acute asthmatic bronchitis, which has a similar effect to suffocation. Maxwell went to court, contending that his wife died of shock after the accident and that he should receive her insurance benefits. 3 years later, Maxwell's nephew was found dead in his car. The cause of death was determined to have come from him driving off the road. The victim, James Hicks, had several papers regarding insurance policies that had been taken out on his life by his mother. However, it was determined that the papers had actually been filled out in Reverend Willie Maxwell's handwriting. It was rumored that the Reverend Maxwell was a good preacher, but he was also known for dabbling in conjure. Maxwell was allegedly seen hanging chickens in the trees around his property. He was also seen painting his doorstep with the blood from the chickens. Rumor in the African American community was that he had worked with the famous Seven Sisters of Algiers and had a secret room where he performed spells in his home. Interviews with people from the community reveal that many people were scared of Maxwell and would go inside their homes when he drove through the neighborhood. He established quite a reputation for preaching for the Lord and also crossing with the spirits. On June 11, 1977, Maxwell's stepdaughter, Shirley Ann Ellington, was discovered dead. The police report vaguely described the death as unusual and, like many of the others related to Maxwell, took place on a rural, country road. The body of the girl was discovered under a car where it appeared she had been changing a tire. Local opinion was that the child was dead before she was placed under the car. On June 20th, Reverend Maxwell delivered the eulogy for his 16-year-old stepdaughter at a local funeral home. As Maxwell exchanged glares with locals who feared and suspected him of the worst, little Shirley Ann Ellington's uncle made his way through the crowd and placed a pistol against the temple of Willie Maxwell. The crowd of 300 onlookers gasped as Robert Louis Burns announced, "He killed Shirley, and he is going to pay for it." Burns fired 3 bullets into Maxwell's face. Maxwell's legacy has burned into the memory of the community of Alexander City. Evidence of Maxwell's conjuring was discovered after his death. Family members went into the Maxwell house and discovered a number of items, including jars filled with blood. Some jars were labeled love, hate, friendship, and death. At Maxwell's funeral, Reverend C. Martis compared Maxwell to Moses, saying he was a murderer and a fugitive, and that he was sent by God to lead his people. Martis went on to say they accused him of being Beelzebub. They talked about him casting out the spirit with spirits. He went on to say that Maxwell is coming back to judge someday. The years following the shooting of Willie Maxwell in Alexander City were filled with rumor and legend that Maxwell would return from the dead to haunt his enemies. So far, he has not returned. There were several undercover operations performed in the Mid-South by police that focused on targeting root workers and spiritual doctors. In some cases, officers would pose as clients seeking help from spiritual advisors. In other cases, officers posed as spiritual healers themselves. Montgomery, Alabama police detective Mike Chisholm became known as the department's voodoo expert and counter-voodoo propagandist. Chisholm carried around mock curios used in hoodoo, including a bag that he made from the packaging that fruit was delivered in that contained dead spiders and flies. In one particular case, Chisholm was called to take a report on a minister who believed himself to be crossed. As many spiritual doctors would do, the detective insisted on searching the man's residence for any evidence of bewitching. Not finding anything, the detective tossed his mock mojo hand behind a piece of furniture. Retrieving it, Chisholm shined an ultraviolet light onto the bag. The flies and spiders inside began to glow eerily. The minister was told to bury the item in the backyard in order to uncross himself. As the minister began to shovel dirt on top of the hand, he immediately began to show signs of release. A similar case involved a woman who had discovered a mysterious powder on her front step. The woman almost destroyed her front steps in an attempt to remove any negative workings that had been performed against her. The detective was called to her residence and performed a mock ritual in which he cursed the person who left the powder. In some cases, it was believed that authorities could detect a practitioner of African folk tradition. Practitioners were frequently called voodoos. In Alabama, it was believed that you could determine if someone was a practitioner if they used healing or magical rituals. In March 1938, a voodoo was detected, and it was observed that he had visited an elderly blind man and had promised to restore the man's sight by throwing a spell. Later that same year, Arkansas spiritualist Reverend H. Coley came under investigation by postal offices in Washington, D.C. Reverend Coley had been barred from sending out flyers offering mojo lucky bags for new customers. Coley billed himself into the advertisements as the man from Algiers, who knows all and sees all. The minister's ads claimed that he could remove jinxes and could designate lucky days. In an odd sequence of events, police were sometimes called on the advice of spiritual workers. In August 1937, a young couple in Athens, Tennessee, visited a local spiritual reader. The reader had such a powerful reputation that some said she could walk the wall backward. She was believed by many to have clairvoyant abilities that allowed her to see how others would die. The reader told the young couple that their niece was going to be involved in a lot of trouble that evening and that they should do whatever it took to stop her from leaving the house. The couple called the local police and had the little girl locked up in jail at the advice of the reader. Conjurers in the Mid-South faced the constant threats of arrest by police. In 1951, a Memphis conjurer named Bill Gilliam was arrested after it was discovered she was providing spiritual and medical treatments for locals. 69-year-old Belle Gilliam, spiritual worker, had been accused of dispensing medicines without a license to members of a local army depot. Local police sent an undercover informant into the home of the woman, who was known locally as a witch doctor, to observe her spiritual practices. The informant complained that he had a headache and had been experiencing bizarre dreams. Belle Gilliam was alleged to have boiled an iron kettle of water above a gas stove and then filled it with dry herbs, including John the Conqueror, furniture polish, and rattlesnake oil. The informant claimed that the woman sat down on a 3-legged stool and began to chant about the devil's plague until the water came to a boil. She then poured the concoction into a cup and demanded that the informant drink it. When the informant hesitated, Gillian rubbed a yellow substance into the informant's hair and then rubbed a black oil substance on the informant's head and repeated her request, "Drink it!" The informant drank the substance and began to have a burning sensation in his stomach. Gilliam charged the informant $10 and assured him that he was now healed. Police would later arrest Gilliam on charges of practicing medicine without a license. Memphis Police Lieutenant W.H. Ragadale reported finding bottles of rattlesnake oil, colored powders, dried herbs, and vile-smelling oils in Gilliam's home. The history of rootwork and conjure in the Mid-South is filled with stories of racism and violence against African Americans. Folk medicine was frequently blamed for crimes, illness, and even murders. In 1957, jailers for the Hinds County Jail in Greenville, Mississippi, blamed voodoo medicine for injuries that the prisoners received while in their care. The victims were placed in a hot box or solitary confinement cell and then beaten with a leather strap. The men who were arrested were part of a group of men who were searching for money using a voodoo machine that appeared similar to a compass. The sheriff's department described the men as going through black magic rites. The 4 men had rubbed voodoo medicine over their bodies to keep the police away as they searched for the money. It was not uncommon for police to discover hoodoo-related evidence in areas of the Mid-South. Birmingham, Alabama police discovered the victim of a shooting on the south side of the city. A local coroner was called to examine the body. The victim, John Deason, was discovered with a collection of traditional conjure items. The following is a list of what police discovered among the victim's personal belongings: a hoodoo bag containing a dead frog and a rabbit's foot, both old and dry, a brass coin of uncertain origin, a rusty horseshoe nail, a piece of quartz, a conjure bag consisting of small roots sewed up in some kind of skin, a brass check, a sack of tobacco, a piece of red flannel soaked in some kind of oil, probably skunk oil, a number of variously shaped buttons, and $1.84 in money. Murders. Fear of the power of conjure has historically made many Southerners do some extreme things. Among the more extreme, tragically, have been incidents in which spiritual workers are targeted and murdered. As far back as 1901, there have been recorded incidences in which root workers have been murdered. In 1901 in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a spiritual doctor was killed by a man who he believed had cursed him. Fred Gray confessed to killing Solomon Russell to stop the effects of a spiritual working that Russell was believed to have sent. Following the murder, Gay performed a protection ritual that included the creation of a circle around his residence. The circle included materials such as blue stone, salt, and red pepper. Gay told authorities that this was done to keep away any spirits that Russell would have sent after him. In 1914, Joe Cook, a root worker in Jonestown, a town in Coahom County, Mississippi, was murdered by George Reynolds. Reynolds was being sentenced to death for the murder of Cook when he began to tell the judge about the circumstances surrounding the case. Reynolds' wife had become very ill and was acting very strangely. Her husband believed that she had been conjured and that Cook was the responsible party. Reynolds told the judge that he believed the only way he could break the horrible curse was to kill the conjurer himself. The judge, seeing the husband's dilemma and obvious respect for the power of conjure, instead sentenced Reynolds to life in prison. In April 1928, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, farmhand Mac Bowen was living on a plantation owned by Mrs. Elbert Jones. Bowen had become sick and feared for his life. He believed that he had been crossed and traveled into another city for some form of protection. Bowen visited local druggist Howard Jones for help after he produced evidence that his bewitching in the form of pieces of old quilts, birds' nests, marbles, and a broken cane. Bowen insisted that these items were proof that he would be soon walking in crutches, so this conjure would work on him. The druggist gave Bowen some medicines as well as some charms to protect himself from the working. Bowen returned home to find a man admiring his wife, whom he had previously warned not to return to his property. The local papers described Bowen as driven wild by the hoodoo. When he shot the admirer and the man's horse, Bowen then proceeded to track down the alleged conjurer who had crossed him, a spiritual doctor who went by the name of Charlie Balfour. Balfour was 90 years old. Bowen, in desperation, killed the doctor in order to try to break the spell. Several years later, in 1943, Memphis native Chester Williams shot his wife and threw her body over a bridge of the Hatchie River, claiming she used voodoo to harm him. He told Memphis police that voodoo ruined my life. 6 years later, Alberta Jefferson, a Knoxville woman, knocked 26-year-old Obie Roberts down a flight of stairs and then shot him. Jefferson told police that Roberts was a voodoo doctor and had placed a death hex on her that had made her blood pressure rise and her neck stiffen and had negatively affected her heart. Killing the spiritual doctor was believed to have released her from this curse. In 1950, a similar case in Greenville, Mississippi developed in which a man shot and killed a suspected conjurer because it was believed that he had placed a crossing, a term used to denote being cursed, on the victim. A high-profile case involving the murder of a spiritual worker occurred in 1957 in Shelby, Tennessee. The victim was killed because his client believed he had placed a curse on him. 40-year-old Moses M. Martin from Stevenson, Alabama, had sought guidance from spiritual worker Simon T. Warner, known for his healing and psychic abilities in the Mid-South. Moses drove up from Alabama to seek help for digestive problems he was having with his stomach. Warner charged him $60 for spiritual treatment that was intended to remove Moses' ailment. After leaving the healer's home, Moses began to feel severe discomfort and fear. He began to perspire and his heart raced. His head filled with fears, dabbling with magic and thoughts of worry. Moses could feel the spiritual rope tightening across his chest. It became difficult to breathe. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, sometimes clutching the tattered cover of an old Holy Bible next to his side. Moses worried that it was no longer the stomachache that haunted him, but the insidious spirits that spirit doctor had loosened on him. He could not take any more of the psychological torture from the white spiritualist who had performed this mysterious operation on him. Moses reached into the bureau beside his bed and retrieved a .32 caliber pistol. The 85-mile trek from Stevenson to Shelbyville, Tennessee, seemed to take forever. Moses' car sputtered and spurred on a cold rain began to fall across the hallway. Moses could almost feel the relief that he was about to experience when he would break the spell that haunted him. On arriving at Simon Warner's place, Moses slipped his pistol into the back of his pants. Warner met him at the door with a smile and greeting. "Nice to see you again, Mr. Moses. What can I do for you today?" Moses' heart began to race against him, and he mumbled, There's something I need to talk to you about, something important." Warner closed the door behind him and began to walk down a long hall, creaking wooden floors. Moses' breathing became louder and his eyes scanned the walls of the home. Paintings of planetary symbols and strange-looking mythical animals adorned the hall. As the two entered the room, Warner turned around and smiled at Mose. "Hope you're feeling better. Last time we met, you weren't doing so well." As Warner closed the door to the consultation room, Mose Martin stared at the crystal ball and tarot cards spread across a wood table. For a moment, he worried that Warner might come back to haunt him from the grave, but none of that mattered now. This curse that Warner had placed on him was killing him physically and spiritually. Mose reached back into the bottom of his shirt and presented the pistol to Warner's chest. What are you doing?" Mose's eyes bulged with intensity as he felt the nose of the pistol finding resistance against Simon Warner's chest. "I'm about to set myself free, Conjure Man. I ain't no fool. I know you put a curse on me and I'm about to break it free." Mose Martin fired 5 shots from the pistol into Simon Warner. Following the discovery of the body, local police put out an all-points bulletin to all regional law enforcement agencies. Mose Martin was stopped more than half an hour away from the scene of the murder. Martin and his girlfriend, Pearl Hutchison, were stopped by the Alabama Highway Patrol. Martin confessed to the crime. It was documented that Martin testified to police, "I shot him because he double-crossed me in voodoo. He admitted before I shot him that he had double-crossed me. I would have shot anybody who double-crossed me in the back with black magic like he did." Warner would go on to testify in Davidson County Jail that he believed that the shooting did not break the curse. Instead, he claimed that a magical string was being tightened across his body. He told a local reporter from the Tennessean, "The string is still around me." As he removed his shirt to reveal that there was nothing visible around his stomach, Martin testified that Simon Warner told him that he would never get well. He continued, "I waited for it to go. I don't think it'll ever go now. There's no other way to break it. If you were killing me, wouldn't that be enough reason for me to kill you?" Simon Warner's legacy as a spiritual worker while he was alive was prolific. Warner discovered that he had spiritual powers at the age of 10, a white man. He soon became well known for being able to predict various incidents. When his powers of perception became known in the community, many people began to seek his assistance in finding lost materials, lost loves, and financial guidance. Warner recalled one experience in which 2 men approached him about getting his guidance in locating a buried treasure. A group of Native Americans was said to have buried a chest of gold, and the men promised to give Warner $2 if he could locate the gold. Warner told the men thank you, and said that if he could locate it, he would keep it and give them $2. Warner became famous in 1941 when he supernaturally located the body of a missing Chapel Hill woman. When police found the body, news about Warner spread throughout the world. He began to receive hundreds of letters every day asking for his assistance in locating objects and people, as well as questions about love. Warner became known as the crime doctor, using what he called character readings to see into the supernatural. He developed an ability to see when someone was going to die. He would frequently work with law enforcement to provide them insight into when he would foresee a potential murder in the community. In 1945, the Shelbyville Seer, as he became known locally, helped in bringing a fugitive to justice when an African-American farmer had beat his 7-year-old niece with a piece of wood. Police searched for 2 days to locate Andrew Fagan. He turned up at Simon Warner's residence seeking advice. Warner consulted the spirits and advised Fagan to turn himself in. The seer accompanied Fagan to the local police department, where he surrendered to local authorities. Warner went out to study criminology and created a crime show exhibit that he wanted to take around the world. The $75,000 collection featured a number of mannequins dressed as famous criminals, including Adolf Hitler and John Dillinger, and was focused on curbing juvenile crime. Warner had a half-sister known locally as Granny Jones, who was practiced in folk healing. She was also known as an effective spiritual reader who used playing cards to divine the future. Residents tell of taking their children to see her for healing. Granny, aka Bessie Jones, was known to have the power to remove warts, burns, and scars through various rituals. Some root workers and conjurers have been killed because of what their assailants viewed as lack of effectiveness. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, a spiritual worker was murdered by one of his clients after the working he had performed failed. The Reverend Henry B. Johnson promised to hoodoo the dice of his client, 50-year-old ex-convict C.C. Moore. He was so confident in his spiritual services that he promised a money-back guarantee. The client continued to lose and later confronted the minister. Johnson refused to pay and Moore attacked him, beating him about the head and cutting his throat. As African-derived religions and healing practices were constantly blamed for crime, murder, and deviancy in the Mid-South, some chose to blame acts of terrorism on devotees of these practices. In March 1956, a Brookhaven, Mississippi man was investigated by police after a bomb exploded in a post office in New Orleans, Louisiana. 3 days before the bomb exploded, a letter was sent out to local police department threatening to blow it up. The letter read, "We are so high you cannot climb over us, so low you cannot get beneath us, and so broad you cannot get around us, so you must go through us or by us. You must go straight. Your name has been handed to us as a rat and a double crosser. To this we give you a 10 days warning to get back in line, or go where you just left, or else stand the consequences. You may run, but you can't hide. We will make you melt away like dry ice in a vapor on a hot day and lose everything. No one will be able to help you." The threat appeared to specifically target one or a number of individuals. As puzzling as it was, the signature was even more puzzling. The letter was signed Marie Laveau III, Queen of Voodoo. Conjure in the courtroom. Courtrooms in the Mid-South had come to witness a number of cases involving root work and conjure throughout the years. In 1899, a judge heard a case involving two conjurers who sold a defective charm to a client. The conjurers had charged $7 for a charm that was alleged to secure employment, good health, and an abundance of work. One of the men gave the client what was described as a hoodoo jack or hand. The charm consisted of a small piece of lodestone wrapped in a red flannel cloth. Apparently, after carrying the charm for a period of time, the client decided that it was ineffective. He approached the two conjurers and asked for his money back. After receiving only a portion of the money back, the client, Tom Parker, took the case to the local police. The men were arrested and charged with obtaining money under false pretenses. In October 1925, a courtroom in Jackson, Mississippi, listened to a curious tale from witnesses who spoke against spiritual worker Sarah Boyd. Boyd had been brought up on charges for disturbing the peace. While Boyd claimed to be a benevolent spiritual worker seeking to free people from their ailments, many in the courtroom saw her as a wicked conjurer. "She pulled woodchucks out of my ear," one witness testified. "She made me spit up frogs," claimed another. The courtroom of Judge J.H. Finks watched in shock as witnesses after witnesses came to the stand. One witness claimed that Sarah would get up in the middle of the night and bang on the side of her house, screaming, "I am conjuring you. I am a hoodoo." Many of Sarah's neighbors claimed that she sold conjure bags to people in the community. As a result, the neighbors demanded she be removed from the community. "She is a hoodoo and a conjurer, and we can't live in the same neighborhood with her," exclaimed witnesses. The alleged conjurer claimed that the only spiritual healing work she had done was to formulate herbal teas that were used to heal her clients. Boyd proceeded to explain to the judge what kind of ailments the teas would allegedly cure. After much insistence from her neighbors, Boyd was fined by the judge and ordered to move from the neighborhood. She explained to the judge that she had no money to pay the fine. Witnesses told the local press that Boyd then walked over to her attorney, rubbed a conjure bag against him, causing him to pay her fines to the court. In Prentice, Mississippi, home to blues legend Tommy Johnson, authorities scoffed at the use of conjure-related practices. In 1933, a local believer in conjure sprinkled powder in the chairs of the courtroom attorneys during the court's lunch break. An attorney assisting the prosecuting district attorney was given an extra dose of the powder, according to witnesses. Local newspapers concluded whether Mr. Hall, Pretense, Mississippi District Attorney Toxie Hall, and his associates are impervious to hoodoo dust, or whether the dust lost its magical qualities by some hook or crook is not known. The reporter covering this incident also advised it would be well for other district attorneys over Mississippi to look into the matter and see if there are hoodoo dust resistant.